Chapter 1. Before we begin. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. You don't need to hold on to anything tonight. Not a thought, not a task, not tomorrow. And subscribe this channel for more such videos. For nearly the entire history of our species, roughly 300,000 years, nobody had a job. No boss, no inbox, no alarm demanding to be silenced. And yet, days were full, rich even, just full of different things than ours are. Tonight, we're going to walk through those days, slowly. Not the cartoon version, with grunting cavemen and clubs. The real version, stranger, gentler, and in some ways, quietly enviable. You don't have to remember any of it. You don't have to stay awake for any of it. Just let the story carry you, the way firelight once did, long before there were screens to do that job instead. Let's begin where every day begins, at first light.
Chapter 2. Waking Without a Clock. There was no sound to wake to, no chime, no buzz, only a very old, very quiet signal, light, touching closed eyelids, growing warmer by degrees. For most of human history, this was the only alarm that existed, and the body, it turns out, is extremely good at listening to it. Researchers who studied the Hadza people of northern Tanzania, one of the last groups on Earth still living substantially by hunting and gathering, found something that surprised even sleep scientists. Using small wrist monitors, they tracked when the Hadza actually fell asleep and woke over many weeks across different seasons, and the pattern was remarkably stable. Sleep onset drifted gently with the setting sun, waking drifted gently with the rising one. There was almost no insomnia recorded in the study at all, a condition so common in modern life that entire industries exist just to manage it, was in that camp nearly absent.
The researchers noted something else too. The Hadza didn't sleep dramatically longer than people in cities. What was different wasn't quantity, it was rhythm. Their bodies weren't fighting against light exposure at the wrong hours, weren't confused by screens insisting it was still daytime at 11 at night. Temperature dropped, darkness deepened, and the body simply followed. There was no such thing either as being behind on sleep, no debt to repay. Morning arrived, and whatever the night had given was enough, because there was nothing waiting outside the tent demanding otherwise. Picture it now, waking in the gray hour before full sunrise, in a small shelter of branches and grass, the air still cool. Someone nearby already stirring, low voices, the smell of last night's fire not quite gone out. No urgency yet, just morning, arriving on its own schedule, and a body that already knew what to do with it. Chapter 3. The Myth of the Hunt. Here is something almost every documentary gets slightly wrong. The phrase is always hunter-gatherer, hunting first, as if a man with a spear chasing an animal across open plains was the main event of daily life, and gathering was the quiet afterthought. But look closely at the actual data anthropologists have gathered from groups like the Hadza, the Juahunzi of the Kalahari, or the Ache of Paraguay, and a different picture forms. On most days, in most seasons,
Gathering fed far more people than hunting did. Roots, tubers, berries, nuts, honey, insects, small game caught close to camp, these were the reliable calories. A hunt might return empty-handed 9 times out of 10. A well-known patch of tubers almost never did. And the people who did most of this gathering were overwhelmingly women, often walking together in small shifting groups, carrying infants against their bodies while they worked. Their knowledge of the land was staggering, and none of it was written down anywhere. It lived entirely in memory, carried, tested, corrected, and passed on, voice to voice, mother to daughter, for generation after generation. Which root in this exact season was food? Which nearly identical root at a different time of year was poison? Which bark eased a fever? Which leaves, chewed and pressed, slowed the bleeding of a wound? Anthropologists studying the Martu women of the Western Desert in Australia found their foraging trips weren't random wandering either. They followed patterns refined over an almost unimaginable span of time. Routes chosen based on where certain plants had recovered from the last harvest, timed almost like a rotation, so the land was never taken from too heavily in one place. This wasn't instinct. It was expertise, an entire invisible curriculum, memorized by necessity, taught without a single page of paper. And it fed the tribe far more reliably than any club-wielding hunter ever could. Chapter 4. The Original Affluent Society. In the 1960s, an anthropologist named Marshall Solins looked at data being gathered from groups like these and reached a conclusion that genuinely stunned economists at the time. He called them the Original Affluent Society. Not because they had more possessions, they had almost none, a few tools, a sling for carrying infants, some woven bags. But affluence, Solins argued, isn't only about having a great deal. It can also come from wanting very little and already having enough of that little. Time use studies conducted decades later, tracking the Juansi and the Hadza hour by hour, found something remarkable. Time actually spent acquiring food, the hunting, the gathering, the actual work of survival, often totaled somewhere between 15 and 20 hours a week. Some estimates, in good seasons, came in even lower. The rest of the time was something modern life has almost no real name for. Not leisure exactly, because leisure implies a contrast with work that structures your whole week. It was simply time, resting in shade through the hottest hours, talking, grooming each other's hair, repairing tools slowly, without urgency, because there was no deadline attached to a spear shaft. There was no concept of free time, because there was no opposing concept of time that had been taken from you first. Nobody clocked in. Nobody's hours belonged to someone else. A day simply unfolded at its own pace and belonged entirely to the person living it. Try for a moment to imagine that kind of day. Not empty, not lazy, just unclaimed. Nobody waiting on the other end of it, demanding an output. Chapter 5. Afternoons of Skill. In the slower hours after midday, hands still moved, just not for anyone else's benefit. A man might sit at the edge of camp, turning a piece of flint over and over, studying its grain the way a woodworker studies the direction of a plank. A single strike, angled just right, could split off a blade sharp enough to open skin without any real pressure at all. A wrong strike wasted the stone entirely. This was not guesswork. Experimental archaeologists who've tried to relearn these techniques from scratch, using only stone tools, no instruction beyond the artifacts themselves, often describe years of failed attempts before producing anything close to what a 12-year-old apprentice in that era could likely manage. Because that's who was usually watching: children, seated nearby, not enrolled in anything, not being tested on anything, simply present, absorbing the motion of the hands, the angle of the wrist, the sound a good strike made versus a bad one.
This was education with no classroom, no curriculum, and, this part matters, no separation between learning and living. A child wasn't sent away to be taught elsewhere. Knowledge was simply what happened around them, all day, while the actual business of living continued. Elsewhere in camp, someone else worked plant fiber into cordage, twisting it between palms into rope strong enough to lash a spear point or bind a shelter frame. Someone stitched hide with a bone needle. Someone repaired a woven carrying basket, checking each worn strand with fingers that had done this 1,000 times before. None of it was labor in the sense we use the word now, something traded for wages, evaluated by someone else, timed by a clock. It was simply maintenance, of tools, of skill, of the small physical world that kept a group alive.
And children absorbed it all, quietly, the way children absorb a language just by being spoken to, not through lessons, but through sheer, patient proximity. Chapter 6. Learning Through Play. Watch a modern toddler for 5 minutes, and you'll notice something odd if you think about it. They aren't really playing at nothing. They're rehearsing.
Anthropologists who study childhood among groups like the Aka and Baka forager communities of Central Africa have documented exactly this. Young children spend enormous stretches of the day in something that looks, from the outside, like unstructured play, but is, underneath, almost entirely rehearsal for adult competence. Small children mimic digging for tubers with sticks. They build tiny shelters from leaves and twigs, badly at first, better with time. Boys and girls both practice throwing, tracking, climbing, skills that later will matter enormously, but which for now are simply games. And critically, nobody is grading them. Researchers observed almost no direct instruction at all in early childhood. Adults rarely stopped a child mid-task to correct them the way a modern teacher might. Instead, children learned by watching older children who were only slightly more skilled, and by trying, failing, adjusting, and trying again, entirely on their own timeline.
This produced something researchers found strange and a little humbling. Levels of independence, self-motivation, and competence in these children, well before the age modern children are typically trusted with anything sharp, hot, or heavy, that would seem almost unbelievable by contemporary standards. A 6- or 7-year-old among the Juhoansi might already be a capable, semi-independent gatherer, moving confidently through a landscape most adults today would find disorienting within minutes. Play was never separate from purpose. It simply hadn't been divided from the rest of life yet, the way it later would be.
Chapter 7. Water, Shelter, and the Rhythm of Moving. A shelter, in most of these communities, was never meant to last forever. That wasn't a failure of ambition, it was intelligence. Groups moved, not constantly and not aimlessly, but in a rhythm shaped by water and food. A camp might be used for a few weeks until the nearby plants thinned or the game grew wary, and then, almost without ceremony, the group packed what little they owned and walked to the next known place, somewhere they, or their parents, or their parents' parents, had camped before.
This meant an intimate, almost encyclopedic knowledge of water. Not rivers alone, those were easy, but the hidden sources, a particular hollow in a tree that filled after rain, a patch of ground where, if you dug at the right depth, moisture waited even in dry season. Ostrich eggshells, among some Kalahari groups, were filled with water and buried at marked points along travel routes, days or weeks in advance. An underground network of supply caches, planned with a patience that has almost no modern equivalent. You'd bury water for a version of yourself, or your children, that didn't exist yet. Shelters themselves were often built in under an hour, a dome of bent branches covered with grass or hide sized for a single family, functional, warm enough, and crucially, disposable. There was no attachment to a house the way later settled cultures would develop. Home wasn't a structure. Home was the group of people you traveled with and the land you both knew and trusted.
This mobility carried a hidden freedom modern life rarely offers. If a place turned unpleasant, too many biting insects, a conflict simmering, poor luck with food, you could simply leave. Nobody was bound by a mortgage, a lease, a fixed address. The solution to almost any problem included the option of walking somewhere else. Chapter 8: The Invisible Web of Gift and Trade. You might imagine these small bands as isolated, self-sufficient islands cut off from the world beyond their own camp. The evidence says otherwise, and the reality is far more elegant.
Among the Juhuansi, anthropologist Polly Wiesner documented an extraordinary system called Hexero, a network of gift exchange stretching across enormous distances, sometimes hundreds of kilometers, connecting people who might see each other only once every year or two. Beads, arrows, blankets, tools, small items, not particularly valuable in themselves, were given as gifts, not sold, not bartered in the transactional sense we'd recognize. The value wasn't really in the object, it was in the relationship the gift maintained. Because here is the quietly brilliant part. In a landscape where rainfall is unpredictable and a good camp one year might fail entirely the next, these gift partnerships functioned as insurance. If your region dried up, if the game vanished, if hunger came, you had, scattered across the wider landscape, a network of people who owed you nothing in a strict sense, but who remembered your gifts and who would welcome you into their camp without hesitation. Reciprocity wasn't a transaction. It was a form of long-distance kinship, built deliberately, gift by gift, over years.
Archaeological evidence tells a similar story, going back much further. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its razor-sharp edge, has been found at sites hundreds of kilometers from the nearest source, moving hand to hand across groups who likely never met the original miners. Seashells found deep in the interior of continents, far from any coastline. None of this moved by accident. Long before roads, before writing, before anything resembling a marketplace, humans had already built something remarkably close to a trade network, powered not by currency, but by memory, obligation, and trust. Chapter 9: Healing Without Hospitals. Illness and injury didn't pause simply because there was no hospital nearby, and the response to them was far more sophisticated than the word primitive usually implies. Ethnobotanical studies, researchers cataloging the medicinal plant knowledge of surviving forager and small-scale societies, have recorded thousands of distinct plant-based remedies, many later found, under laboratory analysis, to contain genuinely active compounds. Willow bark, chewed for pain and fever, contains a compound closely related to the active ingredient in modern aspirin. Certain molds, applied to wounds in various traditional medicine systems, produced antibacterial effects that wouldn't be scientifically explained for thousands of years in the story of penicillin.
This knowledge was earned the hard way, through generations of careful, dangerous trial. Someone, at some point, discovered the difference between a healing plant and a fatal one, likely at real cost. And rather than being lost, that knowledge was folded into memory and myth, kept alive by repetition, so the next person wouldn't have to pay that price again. But perhaps the most moving evidence isn't about herbs at all. It's about care. At a Neanderthal site known as Shanidar, in what is now Iraq, researchers found the remains of an individual, now referred to as Shanidar I, who had suffered severe injuries decades before death. A withered arm, partial blindness likely, significant hearing loss. By any measure, someone who could not have hunted, could barely have gathered, and would have been, in a purely survival of the fittest sense, a liability to the group.
And yet, the skeletal evidence shows this person lived for years, perhaps decades after those injuries, long enough for old wounds to heal and remodel completely. Someone brought him food he couldn't gather himself. Someone protected him. Long before written history, long before any concept of charity or hospital, care for the vulnerable already existed, not as an abstract virtue, as a lived daily practice. Chapter 10: Keeping the Peace Without Police. Small groups, living in close quarters for months at a time, inevitably produced friction, jealousy, slights, the occasional serious conflict. So how, without police, without courts, without prisons, did these communities avoid tearing themselves apart? The answer researchers keep arriving at is almost anticlimactic in its simplicity: gossip, humor, and an intense, almost aggressive commitment to equality.
Anthropologists studying groups like the Juhuanzi documented something they came to call leveling mechanisms, social tools used quite deliberately to prevent any one person from gaining too much status, pride, or power over others. If a hunter made an exceptional kill, custom demanded he not boast about it. In fact, others in the group would often mock the kill openly, calling the animal scrawny, the meat poor, even as everyone prepared to eat well that night. This wasn't cruelty, it was a safeguard. A successful hunter who began to believe himself superior to others was, historically, a dangerous thing for group cohesion, so the group collectively and instinctively cut that pride down before it could take root. Disputes were handled, more often than not, through extended, sometimes loud, group conversation, everyone weighing in, the way an extended family might argue over dinner, until some resolution, or at least an exhausted truce, was reached. Ridicule, gentle or sharp, served as a correction for bad behavior long before anything like formal punishment was needed. Someone behaving selfishly or too aggressively would find themselves the subject of jokes, of exclusion from certain conversations, of 1,000 tiny social costs, usually enough on its own to bring the behavior back in line.
In the rare cases where conflict escalated seriously, the ultimate solution, again, was simple. People could leave, join a different band, walk to relatives elsewhere. No one was trapped in a conflict they couldn't walk away from. It wasn't a utopia, but it was, in its own unwritten way, a functioning justice system, built entirely on relationship, memory, and the quiet, constant pressure of a community that knew you far too well for pretense.
Chapter 11: Becoming an Adult. There was rarely a diploma, but there was almost always a threshold, a moment marked deliberately, when a child was formally recognized as something more. Coming-of-age rites, documented across an extraordinary range of cultures, varied enormously in their specifics but shared a common architecture. A period of separation from ordinary life, a period of hardship, teaching, or testing, and then a return, welcomed back not as the child who left, but as someone new. Among some San groups, a young man's first successful large-kill hunt was marked with ritual significance far beyond the meat itself. Small cuts made to commemorate the achievement, stories told about it for years afterward, a formal shift in how the community spoke to and about him. Among many groups, young women's first menstruation was marked with its own set of rites, sometimes seclusion, sometimes celebration, almost always an acknowledgement that something significant, worth marking, had occurred.
What's striking, looking across these traditions, is how intentional they were about the psychological weight of the transition. Modern adolescence, in much of the world today, is often strangely undefined, a long, ambiguous stretch with no clear beginning or end, no formal community acknowledgement that a threshold has been crossed. Ancient and small-scale societies rarely left that so unclear. There was a before, a ritual, and an after, and everyone around you understood and treated you accordingly once it was done. There was something the ritual gave that mere aging alone doesn't, a witnessed, communal moment of becoming. Not something you decided about yourself, alone in your own head. Something conferred by people who mattered to you in front of everyone who would matter to you for the rest of your life.
Chapter 12. Marks, Color, and Meaning. Long before anything resembling a mirror existed, people still cared deeply about how they appeared to others.
Shell beads, pierced deliberately and strung, likely as necklaces or attached to clothing, have been found at sites across Africa and the Middle East, dating back over 100,000 years, among the oldest deliberate ornamentation we have ever discovered. Someone, that long ago, sat with a small shell, painstakingly worked a hole through it with a stone point, and threaded it, purely because it meant something to be seen wearing it. Cave art, most famously at sites like Lascaux in France, or the far older paintings recently dated in Indonesian caves, shows an even more startling sophistication, animals rendered with real anatomical accuracy, sometimes depicted mid-motion, using the natural curve of cave walls to suggest depth and movement, techniques that wouldn't be formally invented again in Western art for tens of thousands of years.
None of this was necessary for survival, in the narrow sense. And that's exactly what makes it so moving. Long before jobs, before economies, before anything resembling leisure as a category separate from work, humans were already making beauty. Already marking their bodies, their walls, their tools, with meaning that served no purpose beyond simply mattering to them.
Chapter 13. Grief, long before religion had a name. Death arrived, as it always has, without much warning. And the response to it tells us something quietly profound about who these people were. At Sungir, in what is now Russia, archaeologists uncovered a burial roughly 34,000 years old. 2 children laid head to head, covered in an almost unbelievable quantity of ivory beads. Researchers calculated that a single bead, using the tools available at the time, likely took around an hour of careful work to produce. The burial contained thousands of them.
thousands of hours, invested not in anything that would keep the living fed or warm, but purely in honoring the dead.
At sites far older still, evidence of intentional burial, bodies placed deliberately, sometimes with red ochre scattered over them, sometimes with objects placed beside them, suggests that grief and some form of ritual response to it is not a recent human invention. It may be closer to a core feature of what makes us human at all. We don't know and can never fully know what belief systems accompanied these burials, whether they imagined an afterlife, a spirit world, ancestors watching. But the care itself speaks clearly, even across such an enormous span of time. Someone loved these children enough to spend thousands of hours making beads for a body that could no longer wear them, could no longer know they'd been made at all. Grief, it turns out, doesn't need a written religion to be real. It only needs love and the terrible fact of losing it.
Chapter 14. The Grandmother in the Firelight. There's a theory in evolutionary anthropology, known somewhat plainly as the grandmother hypothesis, and it may explain something genuinely strange about our species. Most mammals remain fertile until close to the end of their lives. Humans, specifically human females, are a rare exception, often living decades beyond menopause. For a long time, evolutionary biologists found this puzzling. From a purely reproductive standpoint, why would evolution favor decades of life with no further offspring? The answer researchers increasingly favor is this: grandmothers weren't reproducing anymore, but they were enormously valuable in other ways. Studies of the Hadza found that older women, freed from the demands of nursing infants of their own, often became the most productive food gatherers in the entire camp, bringing in more tubers in a day than younger mothers juggling small children could manage. That food in turn supported grandchildren directly, improving their chances of survival measurably.
But the contribution went well beyond calories. Grandmothers were repositories of exactly the kind of knowledge that couldn't be rushed. Which plant, in a drought this severe, had last been reliable 40 years ago, during the last drought like it? Which stories carried which lessons? Which songs accompanied which season? In a world with no written record, an elder wasn't simply respected out of sentiment. She was, quite literally, the group's memory, its only access to knowledge older than a single generation's direct experience. Around the evening fire, it was very often the oldest members of the group who held the floor longest, their stories carrying not just entertainment, but survival information encoded so deeply into narrative that a child could recite the tale and, without realizing it, know exactly what to do the next time drought or danger came.
Chapter 15. Firelight and the Real Purpose of Stories. As the light softened toward evening, the whole rhythm of the day shifted. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner, the same researcher who documented the Haxaro gift networks, also spent years recording almost word for word the actual conversations of the Juhuansi, comparing what was said during the day against what was said at night around the fire. The daytime conversations, she found, were mostly practical: complaints about a poor hunt, minor disputes, coordination, who was going where, who needed what, ordinary, slightly irritable human chatter.
But at night, by firelight, something changed. Nearly 80% of nighttime conversation shifted into an entirely different register: storytelling. Myths about ancestors and the origins of the world. Personal histories, told and retold until they'd been shaped into something closer to legend. Songs, dances, when the mood allowed. Wiesner's theory is that firelight itself may have played a role in this shift.
During the day, in bright light, humans are highly attentive to social hierarchy and status. Who's more skilled? Who made the better kill? Who said what to whom? But firelight softens the visual field. Faces blur slightly at the edges. The practical, status-conscious part of the mind seems to relax, and something more imaginative, more communal, opens in its place.
These stories weren't idle entertainment, even though they clearly were entertaining. They carried the rules of the world, hidden gently inside character and plot, so that children absorbed morality and history the way they absorbed language itself, through sheer immersion, without ever once being formally lectured. Imagine that now, a circle of faces, lit orange from below, voices rising and falling, and somewhere in the story, hidden but unmistakably present, every lesson a child would need to survive the years ahead.
Chapter 16. Reading the Sky. Long before calendars existed on paper, the sky itself was the calendar, and people read it with a fluency that would astonish most of us today. Aboriginal Australian communities, across an extraordinarily long and continuous cultural tradition, developed detailed astronomical knowledge passed entirely through oral tradition. The position of certain stars signaling exactly when particular plants would fruit, when certain fish would run, when it was time to move camp toward the coast or inland. The appearance of the Pleiades star cluster, in many cultures across the world independently, marked a seasonal turning point, its rising just before dawn signaling the start of one season, its disappearance signaling another.
Polynesian navigators, crossing thousands of kilometers of open Pacific Ocean with no instruments at all, memorized the rising and setting points of dozens of stars, using them as a kind of compass, alongside wave patterns, cloud formations, and the flight paths of birds. An entire integrated system of navigation held completely in memory, refined and tested across countless real voyages, with real lives depending on its accuracy. For the average person around a fire, star knowledge may have been simpler, but no less woven into daily life. A particular constellation, visible low on the horizon, might mean the rains were roughly a month away. Another might mean it was time to begin watching for a particular migratory animal's return. There was no anxiety in not knowing what day it was, in the sense we mean that now. There was instead a deep, practiced fluency in knowing what season it was, what the sky was telling you right now, tonight, simply by looking up.
Chapter 17. The Second Sleep. And now, finally, back to the night itself, because even sleep in that older world had a different shape than we usually imagine. Historian A. Roger Eckerch spent years combing through diaries, court records, and literature from pre-industrial Europe and found consistent, repeated references to something almost entirely absent from modern life: a first sleep and a second sleep. People, it seems, often went to bed not long after dark, slept for several hours, and then woke, not in distress, not from insomnia, but simply as a natural, expected part of the night. This waking period, sometimes lasting an hour or more, was used for quiet reflection, soft conversation with a partner, prayer, tending the fire, or occasionally visiting a nearby neighbor still awake in the same rhythm. Then, unhurried, a second sleep would follow, carrying the sleeper through to dawn.
There was no anxiety attached to this waking, no frustration, no glancing at a glowing clock calculating how many hours of sleep remained. It was simply expected,
as normal as feeling hungry partway through a long day. Some sleep researchers have since suggested that this two-phase pattern may actually align more closely with our natural biology than the single unbroken block of sleep modern life demands of us, a pattern that only began to disappear once artificial lighting made staying up through that middle window far more tempting and far more common. If you find yourself waking in the middle of tonight then, however briefly, there is nothing at all wrong with you. You may simply be doing something extremely old, something your body has done, quietly, for longer than written history has existed. Let it happen without resistance, and let the second sleep come when it's ready, exactly the way it always has.
Chapter 18. The Turning of the Year. No single day stood alone. Each one sat inside a much larger, slower rhythm, the turning of an entire year. In many temperate and cold-climate hunter-gatherer societies, life shifted dramatically with the seasons. Warmer months might mean dispersal, small family groups spreading out across a wider territory, each following their own hunting and gathering rounds, meeting others only occasionally. Colder months, or the approach of harsh weather, often meant the opposite, gathering into larger, temporary aggregations, pooling stored food, sharing shelter, leaning on the wider group for warmth and safety during the hardest stretch of the year.
Among some Arctic and subarctic peoples, this seasonal rhythm was extreme, almost beyond modern imagining. Months of near-constant daylight in summer, followed by months of near-constant darkness in winter, each demanding an entirely different rhythm of activity, sleep, and survival strategy, refined and passed down across countless generations who had no choice but to master it. In more temperate regions, seasonal gatherings often carried enormous social importance beyond simple practicality. Certain times of year, when a particular fruit ripened, or a fish run peaked, or migratory animals passed through in enormous numbers, became the setting for gatherings involving dozens or even hundreds of people from otherwise scattered bands. These were the moments marriages were arranged, disputes between distant groups were resolved, trade networks were renewed face-to-face, and, very likely, an enormous amount of the storytelling and myth-making that shaped an entire culture's worldview took place, concentrated into a few intense weeks, then carried back outward, in memory, to the smaller camps for the rest of the year. A year, in that world, wasn't a flat repetition of identical days. It had a real shape, contraction and expansion, solitude and gathering, scarcity and abundance, a shape the body and the community both learned to move with rather than against. Chapter 19. When the rhythm began to change. Somewhere, gradually, in different places at different times, this rhythm began to shift. Not overnight, not by any single decision, but slowly over many, many generations, some communities began staying in one place, planting instead of only gathering, tending herds instead of only following wild ones. This transition, what's usually called the Neolithic transition, is, in a real sense, the beginning of something recognizable as work in the modern sense. Once crops were planted, they had to be tended, on a schedule the plants themselves demanded, not one chosen freely by the people caring for them. Once a harvest existed, it had to be stored, defended, sometimes rationed. Time-use studies comparing early agricultural societies to hunter-gatherer groups have found, somewhat counterintuitively, that farming often meant more hours of labor per week, not fewer, a harder, more repetitive, more anxious kind of work than the flexible rhythm it gradually replaced. Along with agriculture came surplus, and along with surplus came, for the first time in human history, meaningful inequality, some households accumulating more grain, more livestock, more land than others. Along with surplus came something closer to hierarchy, chiefs, then kings, Then, very much later, employers. The gentle, fiercely egalitarian leveling mechanisms that had kept ancient bands roughly equal for hundreds of thousands of years began slowly to erode, replaced by systems where status could be inherited, stored, and passed down, rather than earned fresh in each generation and gently mocked back into balance around the fire.
It would be wrong to call this simply a decline. Agriculture eventually allowed for enormous populations, for cities, for writing, for nearly everything that followed. But it's worth sitting, just for a moment, with what was quietly lost along the way, a version of daily life where a person's time belonged almost entirely to themselves. Chapter 20. What We Carried Forward. So here we are, long after that fire has gone cold, long after those particular stars have shifted their positions in a sky none of them would fully recognize now. And yet, somehow, pieces of that old life are still inside you.
Chapter 20. The Small Fire That Changed Everything. Before we go further, it's worth slowing down on something we've mentioned again and again without ever really looking at closely: fire itself. Making fire from nothing was never simple. Two methods dominated most of human history. The hand drill, a straight stick spun rapidly between two palms against a wooden base, generating friction, then heat, then, if you were patient and a little lucky, a tiny coal of glowing wood dust. Or the bow drill, a slightly more advanced version, using a small bow to spin the stick faster and with less exhausting effort, a technique that shows up, independently invented, in cultures with no contact with one another at all, across nearly every continent. Either way, it was slow. It took real skill, patience, and dry conditions. A coal, once created, was fragile. It had to be nursed into flame with dry tinder, breath, and care, cupped in hands like something almost alive. Because of this, fire was rarely allowed to go out entirely. Camps carried embers, sometimes literally, wrapped and protected from one location to the next, rather than starting entirely from scratch each time. Some communities maintained what amounted to a continuous fire lineage, coals passed down, tended, never fully extinguished for years.
Fire changed the body itself over evolutionary time. Cooked food is dramatically easier to digest than raw food, softer, often more calorie-dense once heat breaks down tough fibers and proteins. Some researchers, notably primatologist Richard Wrangham, have argued that the mastery of fire and cooking may be one of the single biggest reasons human brains were able to grow as large as they did, freeing up energy that would otherwise have gone entirely into digesting raw, difficult food, and redirecting it toward the extraordinarily expensive organs sitting inside our skulls. And fire changed the day itself. Before it, activity almost certainly ended hard at dusk. After it, the evening became usable, extended, social, safe from most predators, warm enough to sit through cold nights in conversation rather than huddled in silence. In a very real sense, the fire didn't just cook dinner, it invented the evening.
Chapter 21. Life in the Desert's Wide Silence. Not every ancient life looked the same. The land shaped the day completely, and nowhere more dramatically than the desert. In the Kalahari, temperatures could swing violently between a blistering midday and a genuinely cold night. Sand communities adapted their entire rhythm around this. The hardest physical work, the longest walks, done in the cooler hours near dawn, with the punishing heat of midday reserved for rest in whatever shade could be found, often under a single acacia tree shared by the whole group.
Water dictated almost everything. Some Kalahari groups became remarkable experts at extracting moisture from unlikely sources. Certain melons that stored water reliably, even in dry months. Roots specifically valued not for calories, but purely for the liquid inside them, squeezed and sipped like a wild-grown water bottle. Walking distances that would exhaust a modern city dweller within an hour, 10, 15, sometimes 20 kilometers in a day, were simply ordinary, done at an efficient, unhurried pace, refined over a lifetime of practice. Persistence hunting, documented among some Kalahari groups, remains one of the more astonishing feats recorded by anthropologists. A hunter, on foot, tracking a single animal, like a kudu or eland, for hours, sometimes most of a day, in brutal heat, not by outrunning it, but by never letting it fully rest, exploiting the fact that humans regulate heat through sweating far more efficiently than most four-legged animals do, until the animal, overheated and exhausted, could finally be approached and taken. A hunt won not by speed, but by patience stretched across an entire punishing afternoon.
The desert didn't offer abundance easily, but it offered clarity, a landscape where every resource had to be known precisely, or you simply didn't survive in it, and generation after generation, that knowledge held. Chapter 22. Life Beneath the Canopy. Now picture the opposite extreme entirely, not open, sun-baked plains, but the deep, layered green of tropical rainforest, the world inhabited by groups like the Muti and Baka of Central Africa, or the Batek of the Malay Peninsula. The forest also offered something the open desert couldn't: near constant camouflage and cover, making stealth hunting using nets, traps, and small arrows, sometimes tipped with plant-based poisons, more practical than open pursuit. Different landscape, entirely different toolkit, entirely different set of expert skills, yet built from the same underlying human capacity for extraordinarily patient, detailed environmental knowledge. Two totally different daily lives, shaped by two totally different worlds, both equally, quietly masterful.
Chapter 23. Life Along the Tide Line. A third landscape entirely: the coast, where the rhythm of the day was set not by the sun alone, but by the pull of the moon. Coastal and island communities across the world, from Pacific Islanders to groups along the coasts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, built daily life around tidal cycles with a precision that rivaled any inland group's mastery of the stars. Certain shellfish, crabs, and edible seaweeds were only accessible during low tide, exposed briefly on rocks and sand before the water reclaimed them. Missing that narrow window meant waiting roughly 12 hours for the next one.
Archaeological sites called shell middens, enormous accumulated mounds of discarded shells, built up over centuries or even thousands of years of repeated harvesting at the same coastal spots, offer an almost unbelievably detailed record of exactly what people ate and when, stretching back tens of thousands of years in some locations. In parts of Korea and Japan, a tradition of free-diving women, known in Korea as henyo, harvested shellfish, seaweed, and other sea life by holding their breath and diving repeatedly, sometimes to considerable depth, across a working day, without modern diving equipment of any kind. While the formally recorded henyo tradition is more recent historically, researchers believe similar free-diving foraging practices, passed down almost entirely among women, likely stretch back much further, representing a specialized, physically demanding expertise refined over an enormous span of time.
Coastal diets, rich in the fatty acids found abundantly in fish and shellfish, have even been proposed by some researchers as a contributing factor in human brain development. Another quiet, unglamorous piece of evidence for just how much the specific landscape a community called home shaped not just their daily rhythm, but potentially the trajectory of the species itself. Chapter 24: Thin Air and High Ground. And then the mountains, where the challenge wasn't heat or thick undergrowth or tides, but simply the air itself. Populations living at extreme altitude, particularly in the Andes and the Tibetan Plateau, developed genuine biological adaptations to low oxygen environments over many generations. Differences in lung capacity, in blood oxygen handling, in some cases in the density of oxygen-carrying capillaries throughout the body. Differences researchers have confirmed through genetic study, distinguishing high-altitude populations measurably from their lowland relatives. Daily life at altitude demanded its own specific expertise. Herding, of llamas and alpacas in the Andes, of yaks across the Tibetan Plateau, became central to survival in landscapes too harsh and thin-soiled for reliable, large-scale gathering alone. These animals provided not just meat, but wool for warmth against brutal mountain cold, and, crucially, transport, the ability to carry loads across terrain that would exhaust a human back alone. Vertical movement itself was a defining daily feature. Communities often exploited what researchers call vertical archipelago strategies, maintaining access to multiple altitude zones simultaneously, growing or gathering different resources at different elevations within the same general territory, moving people and goods up and down slopes across the seasons to take advantage of what each zone offered, from lowland crops to high-altitude grazing. Cold itself demanded constant practical mastery. Clothing layered from animal hide and dense wool, shelters built low and thick-walled against wind, fires tended with particular care in an environment where fuel itself could be scarce above the tree line. Every landscape, in the end, produced its own quiet genius. The desert's patience, the forest's memory, the coast's timing, the mountain's endurance. Different terrain, endlessly different daily lives, and yet everywhere that same deep, hard-won human fluency with the specific ground beneath their feet. Chapter 25: The Needle Before the Wheel. Long before anything resembling a loom or a spinning wheel, humans were already skilled textile workers, and the evidence for this is more surprising than it first sounds. Bone needles with a clearly deliberate eyelet drilled through one end have been found at sites tens of thousands of years old, proof that fitted, sewn clothing existed far earlier than once assumed. This matters more than it might seem. Simply draping a hide over your shoulders offers real but limited warmth. A fitted garment, sewn snugly at the seams, traps body heat dramatically more effectively. Plausibly, some researchers argue, one of the key technologies that allowed humans to migrate successfully into far colder regions of the world than earlier hominins had managed. Even more remarkably, researchers analyzing ancient clothing lice, a parasite that, unlike head lice, can only survive in the folds of worn clothing rather than directly on skin or hair, have used genetic dating techniques on these lice to estimate roughly when humans began wearing clothing regularly at all, arriving at estimates stretching back over 100,000 years, using nothing more than the evolutionary history of a tiny insect as an unlikely historical record. Fiber itself,
twisted into cordage and thread, has left its own faint trace. Impressions of worn cordage, pressed accidentally into fired clay at some ancient sites, preserve the pattern of fabric or netting that has long since rotted away, a kind of accidental fossil of a technology otherwise nearly invisible to archaeology, since cloth and plant fiber decay so much faster than stone or bone.
The work itself, spinning fiber between fingers or against a thigh, sewing hide with a bone needle and sinew thread, weaving cordage into netting for carrying, fishing, or trapping, would have consumed real hours of the day, largely, though not exclusively, among women, producing something we rarely credit ancient life with at all, genuinely well-made, warm, fitted clothing, sewn by hand from patterns held entirely in memory. Chapter 26. A World Full of Languages. We tend to imagine ancient communication as simple: grunts, gestures, a handful of basic words. The evidence points somewhere far more sophisticated.
Linguists studying the Khoisan language family of southern Africa, known for their distinctive click consonants, have found these languages carry grammatical complexity, in some respects, that rivals or exceeds many modern European languages, with intricate systems for tense, evidentiality, and precise spatial description. Far from primitive, some of these language families are now considered by linguistic complexity alone among the most intricate spoken anywhere on Earth. Multilingualism, too, appears to have been common, not rare, in small-scale societies, particularly wherever different language groups lived in regular contact through trade or intermarriage. Children in these settings often grew up genuinely fluent in 2, 3, sometimes more languages simultaneously, absorbed through the same immersive, instruction-free method used for every other kind of ancient knowledge: sheer, constant exposure.
Among Aboriginal Australian cultures, researchers have documented something called songlines, extraordinarily long oral traditions, encoding sometimes across thousands of kilometers of actual physical geography, detailed navigational and survival information inside song and story. Walking a songline meant, in effect, singing your way across an enormous landscape, the lyrics themselves marking water sources, safe paths, and dangerous ground, memorized precisely enough to guide a traveler accurately across country they might never have physically walked before. Language in that world wasn't simply for casual conversation, it was infrastructure, a container sturdy enough to carry practical survival knowledge across not just distance, but generations, without ever once being written down.
Chapter 27. Raised by the Whole Camp. A modern parent, exhausted, alone with a crying infant at 3 in the morning, might find something quietly comforting in this next piece of evidence. Anthropologists studying child rearing among groups like the Aka of Central Africa coined a term, alloparenting, to describe something that appears to have been the historical norm across much of human evolution, rather than the exception. A child in these communities was rarely cared for by only 1 or 2 parents in isolation. Instead, care was distributed widely. Grandparents, aunts, older siblings, unrelated adults within the same camp, all taking turns holding, feeding, soothing, and teaching the same child, often within a single day.
Some researchers studying Aka fathers specifically found levels of direct paternal involvement, holding, playing with, physically caring for infants, that rank among the highest ever recorded for any human society, historical or modern, challenging any simple assumption that intensive father involvement is a recent, progressive innovation, rather than, in some contexts, a very old norm. This distributed model of care carried real practical benefits. A mother exhausted from a long day of gathering had quite literally other arms to hand her infant to. A child exposed early and often to a wide network of caring adults, rather than one or two exclusively, appears in some studies to develop broader social trust and flexibility earlier. And crucially, no single caregiver bore the entire isolating weight of child rearing alone, the way so much of modern life quietly, unfairly demands. The phrase, "it takes a village," gets used almost thoughtlessly now. But in this context, it wasn't a saying. It was simply, literally, how every single child in that world was raised.
Chapter 28. Bringing a Life into the World. Birth, across almost every documented small-scale society, was treated as significant, but rarely as the isolated, sterile, single expert event much of the modern world has made it. Among many traditional communities, birth was attended by experienced women, often, though not always, older women who had given birth themselves multiple times, functioning as informal midwives with genuinely deep, practically earned expertise. Positions used during labor varied by culture, but very often included upright, active positions, squatting, kneeling, supported standing, rather than lying flat, a posture increasingly recognized by modern obstetric research as offering real mechanical advantages during labor that had, in many contexts, simply been forgotten and only recently rediscovered.
Herbal knowledge specific to birth, plants to ease pain, to encourage labor when it stalled, to help stop bleeding afterward, formed its own specialized branch of the wider plant knowledge we discussed earlier, often held particularly closely among the older women who most often assisted births. Infant mortality, it's important to say honestly, was real and significant in ancient life, considerably higher than in the modern world with its medical interventions. This is not a detail to romanticize away. But surviving infancy was met in turn with real communal celebration and enormous ongoing investment of shared attention, precisely because of how genuinely precarious that early passage was understood to be. Nursing, too, extended considerably longer on average than typical modern practice, often 2 to 4 years in many documented hunter-gatherer societies, a practice which, alongside near constant physical closeness between mother and infant, is now understood by researchers to have also functioned, somewhat incidentally, as a natural, though imperfect, form of birth spacing.
Chapter 29. What the Night Meant to Them. We've talked about how ancient people slept. But what did they believe was happening while they dreamed? Across an enormous range of documented cultures, dreams were rarely dismissed as meaningless static from a resting brain, the way much of modern secular thought tends to treat them. Among many Aboriginal Australian traditions, dreaming connects directly to an entire cosmological framework, often translated, imperfectly, as the dreaming. An understanding of time and creation, where ancestral, dream, and waking realities are woven together far more closely than most Western frameworks would recognize. In many small-scale societies documented by anthropologists, a particularly vivid or unusual dream might be shared publicly the next morning, discussed by the group, occasionally treated as carrying genuine practical guidance, a warning about a particular direction not to travel, an omen about weather ahead, a message understood to come from an ancestor. Dream sharing itself, some researchers have argued, may have served a real social function beyond any literal predictive value, a low-stakes, ritualized way of voicing anxieties, hopes, or grievances that might have been harder to raise directly in ordinary daylight conversation. Certain plants and practices, used sparingly and often within specifically ritual contexts in various cultures, were understood to produce especially vivid or significant dream states, approached in the documented traditions where this occurred with real ceremony and caution, guided typically by an experienced elder or specialist rather than casually.
Whatever modern neuroscience eventually came to say about the biological mechanics of REM sleep and dreaming, and it says a great deal, it's worth remembering that for the overwhelming majority of human history, the meaning of a dream wasn't considered a private, disposable accident of the sleeping brain. It was often treated as something worth bringing back into the daylight and taken seriously by the whole group. Chapter 30. The jokes that held things together. We touched earlier on how ridicule and gentle mockery helped keep egalitarian communities in balance. But humor ran deeper than simple correction. It was often built directly into the very structure of family relationships.
Anthropologists have documented something called joking relationships across a striking range of cultures worldwide. Formal, culturally recognized bonds, typically between specific categories of relatives, such as grandparents and grandchildren, or particular sets of in-laws, where open teasing, exaggerated insults, and outright mockery weren't just tolerated, but actively expected, almost as a kind of ritual affection. Among various groups in West Africa, for instance, entire clans or ethnic groups sometimes maintained formalized joking relationships with one another, a specific pattern where members of one lineage were expected, by long custom, to tease and mock members of another whenever they met, a tradition researchers believe historically helped defuse tension between groups who might otherwise have real grounds for conflict, replacing potential hostility with an oddly affectionate, ritualized insult exchange instead.
Within a single camp, humor served a similarly practical role in everyday survival. A failed hunt, retold later around the fire with self-deprecating exaggeration, became a story rather than a humiliation. A near miss with a dangerous animal, recounted with comic timing days later, processed genuine fear into shared laughter, and shared laughter, again and again, into stronger bonds between the people who'd nearly faced disaster together. None of this was frivolous, even though it was, by every account, genuinely funny. It was social maintenance, as necessary and deliberate in its own way as tending a fire or sharpening a blade. A group that could laugh together, it turns out, was a group considerably more likely to survive together, too.
Chapter 31. The Rules Nobody Wrote Down. Every known human society, without exception researchers have found so far, operates by rules. And ancient small-scale societies were no different, even without a single written law. Food taboos appear across an enormous range of documented cultures. Specific animals, or parts of animals, forbidden to certain people at certain times, for reasons ranging from the practical to the deeply symbolic. Some food restrictions, researchers have found, quietly served real nutritional logic, protecting a scarce resource from overharvesting by restricting its use to specific ceremonial occasions, for instance, or ensuring pregnant women avoided foods that carried genuine, if not consciously understood, risk.
Incest avoidance, meanwhile, appears close to universal across human cultures, and researchers studying kinship systems have found extraordinarily intricate, formalized rules in many small-scale societies determining precisely who could and could not marry whom. Systems anthropologists have spent entire careers mapping, some involving dozens of named kinship categories, each carrying specific social obligations and marriage restrictions, held entirely in the collective memory of the community, with no register, no document, no official anywhere to consult. Totemism, the practice documented across parts of Australia, the Americas, and Africa of associating specific clans or family lines with a particular animal,
plant, or natural feature, often carrying accompanying taboos against harming or eating that totem species, offered yet another layer of social structure, frequently reinforcing exactly the kind of exogamy, or marrying outward, that helped prevent overly close intermarriage within a small, genetically limited population.
None of these rules needed a courthouse to enforce them. They lived, instead, in the same place all ancient knowledge lived, in memory, in story, in the quiet, constant, watchful presence of a community that simply knew, without needing to check anything down, exactly what was and wasn't allowed. Chapter 32. The First Friendship with Another Species. Somewhere in the long stretch of time before agriculture, before permanent settlement, something remarkable happened that had never happened quite this way before. A wild species began, gradually, to live alongside humans by choice.
Genetic and archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that dogs were domesticated from wolves considerably earlier than once believed, quite possibly more than 20,000 years ago, well before agriculture existed anywhere, among people who were still fully hunter-gatherers. This timing matters enormously. It means the partnership wasn't born from farming or livestock management at all. It began earlier, and almost certainly more informally. Wolves drawn toward the edges of human camps, likely scavenging discarded scraps, with the least fearful, most tolerant individuals gradually, generation after generation, drifting closer. A burial site at Bonn Oberkassel in Germany, roughly 14,000 years old, contains a dog buried alongside two humans, and analysis of the dog's remains shows clear evidence it had suffered from serious illness for an extended period before death, yet had continued to be fed and cared for regardless. Once again, as with the Neanderthal we discussed earlier, the evidence points towards something moving beyond pure utility. Care, extended even toward a companion no longer capable of useful work.
Dogs, once the partnership took hold, offered real practical value: assistance in hunting, warning of approaching danger or predators, warmth on cold nights. But the depth and antiquity of the emotional bond, visible clearly in burial evidence across many ancient sites worldwide, suggests something beyond simple usefulness took root early and never really let go. Long before any other species was domesticated, before the first seed was deliberately planted, before the first animal was penned for milk or meat, humans had already made their first real friend.
Chapter 33. Reading a Sky with No Forecast. Without satellites, without instruments of any kind, predicting weather accurately mattered enormously, and ancient communities developed remarkably sophisticated methods for doing exactly that. Cloud formations were read with real precision, passed down through direct, repeated experience. Certain cloud types and patterns reliably preceding rain within a day or two, others signaling a longer dry stretch ahead. Knowledge that modern meteorology has since largely confirmed as genuinely sound atmospheric science, even though it was originally derived purely through patient, multi-generational observation rather than instruments.
Animal behavior offered another rich, reliable set of signals. Certain birds altering their flight patterns or calls before a storm, insects behaving differently as barometric pressure shifted, something modern science has confirmed many species genuinely can sense. Among various Pacific Island navigating traditions, subtle shifts in ocean swell patterns, detectable by an experienced navigator lying directly in a canoe hull to physically feel the water's movement through the vessel itself,
could indicate distant weather systems or the presence of land still well over the horizon, invisible to the eye entirely. Plants, too, offered clues. Certain flowers closing ahead of rain, sensitive to the shift in humidity and pressure long before human senses could detect any change directly. Communities living in fire-prone landscapes developed careful reading of wind, humidity, and vegetation dryness, informing decisions about controlled burning practices, deliberate, carefully managed fires set to reduce dangerous fuel buildup and encourage new plant growth, a sophisticated land management technique used by Aboriginal Australian communities for tens of thousands of years, only much more recently being seriously reconsidered by modern land management science after centuries of largely dismissing it.
None of this was guesswork, however casual it might look from the outside. It was a genuine science, built entirely on accumulated observation, tested against real consequences, and passed forward patiently, the same way everything else in that world was passed forward, person to person, story to story, across a span of time almost too long to properly picture. Chapter 34. Sound Before Words. Long before anyone could read a note of music, music already existed, and the evidence for it is older than most people would guess.
At a site called Hohle Fels in Germany, archaeologists uncovered a flute carved from a griffon vulture's wing bone, dated to roughly 40,000 years ago, carefully hollowed with precisely spaced finger holes, capable of producing a genuine musical scale. It wasn't a crude noisemaker. It was an instrument, made by someone who understood pitch, spacing, and breath control well enough to build something functional on the first real attempt archaeology has preserved. Similar bone flutes have turned up at multiple sites across Europe, some carved from mammoth ivory, others from swan or vulture bone. Different materials, similar careful craftsmanship, appearing independently across different regions and different millennia. Beyond formal instruments, rhythm itself left fainter, stranger traces. Some researchers studying deep cave sites with elaborate paintings have noted that certain chambers show unusual acoustic properties, natural echo and resonance far stronger than in surrounding passages. And intriguingly, some of the most elaborate paintings cluster specifically in these acoustically striking spots, suggesting sound and image may have been deliberately combined, the cave itself functioning almost as an instrument. Dance, by its nature, leaves almost no direct physical trace at all. No bones, no tools, nothing for an archaeologist to dig up. But researchers studying nearly every documented small-scale society on Earth have found dance present in essentially all of them, tied closely to ritual, celebration, mourning, and the coming-of-age ceremonies we discussed earlier. Its near-universal presence across cultures with no contact with one another whatsoever strongly suggests it isn't a later invention layered onto human life, but something close to a core feature of it.
Around the fire, then, on any given night, tens of thousands of years ago, there was very likely more happening than just talk. A flute, perhaps, a rhythm kept by hands against skin or wood, bodies moving together in a shared wordless language older than any spoken one. Chapter 35. Counting Without Numbers. Numbers, in the way we use them now, written digits, precise and abstract, are a genuinely late invention. But the underlying need to count, to track, to measure time, appears remarkably old. The Libambo bone, discovered in a cave in Eswatini and dated to roughly 43,000 years ago, is a baboon fibula marked with 29 distinct notches, cut deliberately in a row. Its exact purpose remains debated, but many researchers believe it functioned as a tally, quite possibly tracking the days of a lunar cycle, since 29 closely matches the length of a lunar month.
The Ishango bone, found near the headwaters of the Nile and dated to a similar span of deep time, carries a more complex arrangement of notches, grouped in a pattern some mathematicians have argued shows early evidence of basic arithmetic groupings, though this interpretation remains genuinely contested among researchers. What both objects suggest, at minimum, is this: long before any written number system existed, people were already tracking quantities deliberately. Days passed, perhaps, kills made, perhaps cycles of the moon, using the oldest counting method available, a mark cut carefully into bone, one notch at a time. This kind of tracking mattered enormously in daily life, even without formal mathematics behind it. Knowing roughly how many days had passed since a water source was last visited, roughly how many days remained before an expected birth, roughly how many notches marked the interval since the rains last came, compared to how many had passed the year before a drought hit. None of this required abstract numeracy in the way a modern accountant would use it. It required only patient, careful tracking, a groove cut into bone, day after day, building slowly into a record that could, unlike unaided memory alone, be checked, recounted, and trusted. Chapter 36: The First Boats. We tend to imagine ancient humans as creatures entirely of the land. But the evidence for early seafaring pushes that assumption further back and further out to sea than most people expect. The island of Flores, in what is now Indonesia, has never, even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, been connected to the Asian mainland by a land bridge. And yet, archaeological evidence shows hominins reaching Flores roughly 1 million years ago, an achievement that could only have happened by deliberately crossing open water, likely using some form of raft, since the distance involved was far too great for accidental drifting alone to fully explain, according to many researchers who've studied ocean current patterns in the region.
Later, fully modern humans reaching Australia, a migration researchers now date to at least 65,000 years ago, based on archaeological sites in the continent's north, required crossing a stretch of open ocean that, even at the lowest Ice Age sea levels, never fully closed. Earliest confirmed open ocean voyages by any hominin species in the entire archaeological record. We have almost no surviving physical evidence of what these earliest boats actually looked like. Wood and reed decay far too quickly to leave a direct trace across such an enormous span of time. But experimental archaeologists have built and successfully tested simple bamboo rafts and reed boats, using only tools and materials that would have been available at the time, demonstrating that a crossing of this kind, while genuinely difficult and dangerous, was entirely achievable with technology no more advanced than lashed timber, buoyant reed bundles, and considerable courage. Long before agriculture, long before metal, long before the wheel, humans had already looked out at open water stretching beyond the horizon and decided to cross it anyway.
Chapter 37: Traps in the Water. Not every fish was caught with a hook and patience. Ancient communities developed remarkably engineered methods for harvesting water on a much larger scale. Fish weirs, arrangements of stakes and woven fencing built directly into a river or tidal flat, designed to guide fish into a narrowing channel or holding pond as the water level dropped, have been found preserved in mud and peat at sites many thousands of years old, in locations ranging from the coasts of Europe to the Pacific Northwest of North America. Some of these structures were genuinely large-scale engineering projects, involving considerable coordinated labor to build and maintain, and clearly designed for repeated use across many seasons, rather than a single catch.
Bone and shell fish hooks,
Some remarkably small and precisely shaped have been recovered from sites tens of thousands of years old, evidence of a technology refined carefully enough to target specific fish sizes and species. Woven basket traps placed in streams to catch fish or shellfish moving with the current require detailed knowledge of exactly where and when to place them, tuned to the specific behavior of the local species being targeted. Among some indigenous communities of the Pacific Northwest coast, salmon runs, the mass seasonal migration of salmon returning upriver to spawn, were met with extraordinarily sophisticated weir and trap systems capable of harvesting enormous quantities of fish within a concentrated seasonal window, historically supporting population densities and degrees of social complexity, including permanent settlements and hierarchical social structures that are unusual among hunter-gatherer societies more broadly, and which challenge the simple assumption that only agriculture can support settled, complex communities.
The water, in other words, wasn't simply fished. In many regions, it was actively engineered, shaped with stakes, weirs, and traps into something closer to a managed, renewable harvest, tended across generations with the same careful, patient expertise applied to every other resource in that ancient world. Chapter 38. Making Food Last. A successful hunt or an especially abundant harvest created its own particular problem: more food for a short while than could possibly be eaten before it spoiled. Solving that problem required real, transferable expertise. Drying meat into something resembling what we might now call jerky appears across an enormous range of ancient cultures, using sun, wind, or smoke to remove enough moisture that bacteria and decay were dramatically slowed, sometimes preserving meat for months rather than days. Smoking, hanging meat or fish over a low, controlled fire, exposing it to smoke rather than direct heat, offered an even more effective preservation method, adding antimicrobial compounds from the smoke itself, a technique requiring real skill to manage, since too much heat cooked the food outright rather than preserving it slowly. Fermentation, too, appears to be extremely old, the deliberate, controlled spoilage of food in a way that produces something safe, sometimes even more nutritious, rather than genuinely rotten. Some Arctic and subarctic communities developed fermentation techniques for fish and meat that modern food scientists have found genuinely increase certain vitamin availability compared to the fresh version, an outcome almost certainly discovered through generations of careful trial rather than any theoretical understanding of nutrition. Underground storage pits, sometimes lined with bark, grass, or stone, kept certain foods, particularly starchy roots and tubers, cool and protected from both spoilage and animal scavengers, sometimes for many months, functioning as a kind of ancient root cellar, its location known precisely and remembered carefully by the group that dug it. None of this preservation work was optional or occasional. In regions with a genuinely harsh winter or a long dry season, the difference between a community that preserved food skillfully and one that didn't was, quite literally, the difference between surviving the lean months and not. This was some of the most consequential labor performed in the entire yearly cycle, and it required a detailed, hard-won expertise in exactly how each specific food, in each specific climate, could be coaxed into lasting far longer than nature alone intended.
Chapter 39. The Weapon That Changed the Hunt. For an enormous span of human history, hunting large or dangerous animals meant getting genuinely close, spear in hand, danger real and immediate. Then, gradually, technology extended that dangerous distance. The atlatl, a spear-throwing device,
essentially a handle with a hook or cup at one end that holds the base of a dart or light spear, acts as an extension of the human arm, dramatically increasing both the speed and distance a projectile can be thrown compared to an unaided throw. Evidence for atlatl use stretches back at least 17,000 years and likely considerably further, appearing independently across multiple continents in cultures with no known contact with one another, a strong sign that the underlying mechanical principle, once discovered, offered such a clear survival advantage that it was likely rediscovered repeatedly, rather than spreading from one single origin point.
The bow and arrow represented an even more significant leap. Evidence for bow use, inferred from the discovery of small, precisely shaped stone arrowheads, distinct in design from the larger points used on spears or atlatl darts, appears in southern African sites dating back over 60,000 years, considerably earlier than many textbooks long assumed. The bow allowed for genuinely long-range, accurate hunting, reducing the danger of close encounters with large or aggressive prey, and requiring an entirely new, refined set of physical skills, a hunter's draw strength, aim, and patience, honed over years, sometimes beginning in the childhood play we discussed much earlier. Poison applied carefully to arrow tips in various cultures, including documented use among some Kalahari sand communities, derived from certain beetle larvae, added a further refinement, allowing even a non-lethal wound to eventually bring down significant game, reducing the need for an immediate fatal shot. Each of these advances, the atlatl, the bow, poisoned points, represented genuine, hard-won technological progress, refined over countless generations of trial, failure, and careful improvement, each one making the ancient hunt measurably safer, more efficient, and more reliable than the one before it. Chapter 40. What belonged to whom? We often assume ancient life had no real concept of ownership at all, everything shared equally, nothing personal. The truth, as researchers have documented it, is more nuanced and honestly more interesting.
Certain items were understood quite clearly as personal. A specific spear, shaped and balanced to one particular hunter's hand and throwing style, a decorated pouch, a set of personal ornaments, tools that had been custom-made or extensively repaired by their owner. These items carried a recognized, respected individual ownership. Taking them without permission would have been a genuine transgression, understood clearly by everyone in camp. But food, and particularly meat from a large kill, operated under an entirely different, far more communal logic in many documented hunter-gatherer societies. Anthropologists studying groups like the Juhuanzi found detailed, sometimes surprisingly formal rules governing exactly how a large kill was divided, not simply given by the hunter as a generous gift, but distributed according to a recognized system, sometimes based on who owned the specific arrow that made the fatal shot, a form of ownership that could be lent, given, or exchanged well before the hunt even began, effectively distributing the social credit and food-sharing obligation across a wider group than the hunter alone.
This system, researchers argue, served a crucial practical function. It prevented any single successful hunter from accumulating disproportionate status or resources, reinforcing the same egalitarian leveling mechanisms we discussed earlier, while still ensuring that a large, perishable kill was shared widely and immediately, rather than hoarded by one family, while a lean hunt left others with nothing. Land itself, in most hunter-gatherer societies, wasn't owned in the exclusive, fenced sense modern life assumes. It was more often understood as territory a group had rights to use and a responsibility to know intimately, belonging less like a possession and more like a relationship maintained through use, memory, and generations of accumulated familiarity.
Chapter 41. Marked Skin. The human urge to mark the body, permanently, deliberately, turns out to be remarkably old, and the most famous direct evidence comes from an unexpected source. Otzi, the naturally mummified body of a man who died in the Alps roughly 5,300 years ago, preserved in ice well enough for modern researchers to study his skin in extraordinary detail, bears over 60 tattoos across his body, simple lines and crosses made by rubbing charcoal into small cuts, concentrated notably along his spine and joints. Medical researchers who examined his remains found that many of these tattoo locations correspond closely to areas showing signs of joint degeneration and wear, leading several researchers to propose that these weren't decorative at all, but a form of ancient therapeutic treatment, remarkably similar in placement logic to modern acupuncture points, applied roughly 2,000 years before acupuncture is formally documented in Chinese medical texts.
Beyond tattooing, scarification, deliberate, patterned scarring of the skin, often achieved through careful, repeated cutting designed to heal into a raised, permanent design, has been documented across numerous African, Pacific, and indigenous Australian cultures, frequently carrying deep social meaning, marking clan identity, marking the completion of a coming-of-age ritual we discussed earlier, or signaling specific social status achieved through demonstrated skill or bravery. Piercing, too, appears extremely old. Archaeological evidence of deliberately stretched earlobes and worn ornaments found across many ancient burial sites, alongside actual pierced jewelry crafted from bone, shell, and stone. Taken together, this evidence points towards something worth sitting with. The body, to ancient people, was never simply a functional tool for survival, used and discarded. It was also, quite deliberately, a canvas, marked with identity, memory, status, and sometimes, as Otzi's tattoos suggest, even an early form of medicine carried permanently and visibly on the skin.
Chapter 42. The Names They Carried. A name, in most documented small-scale societies, was rarely arbitrary. It carried weight, meaning, memory, sometimes even destiny, woven directly into the sound of it. Among many indigenous cultures across Africa, the Americas, and Australia, names were often chosen to reflect the specific circumstances of a birth, the season it occurred in, an unusual event that coincided with it, a quality the parents hoped the child would grow into, or, quite commonly, the name of a recently deceased relative or ancestor, given deliberately to honor and, in the belief systems of some cultures, in some sense continue that person's presence within the family line. Among various Australian Aboriginal traditions, an individual might carry multiple names across a lifetime, a name given at birth, a different name received at initiation, marking the coming-of-age transition we discussed earlier, and sometimes further names earned later, tied to specific achievements, skills, or ceremonial roles attained as an adult. A name, in this framework, wasn't a single fixed label. It grew and changed as the person themselves grew and changed.
In some cultures, names were treated with genuine caution, a belief that a name carried real power, and that using someone's true name too casually, or in the wrong context, could carry real consequences, leading to the common use of nicknames or descriptive terms in everyday conversation, reserving a person's deeper, truer name for more significant or ceremonial occasions. Naming a child in this context was never a small administrative task. It was an act loaded with memory, hope, and belief, each name a small spoken thread connecting a brand new life to everyone and everything that had come before it,
carried forward the moment it was first spoken aloud over a newborn child.
Chapter 43. A Child Not Born to You. We discussed earlier how child-rearing was often widely shared across a whole camp, but sharing care went even further in many documented cultures into something closer to formal adoption and fostering. Anthropologists studying Polynesian societies documented a widespread traditional practice, sometimes called hanai in Hawaiian contexts, the formal, socially recognized fostering of a child by relatives or close community members, sometimes from birth, carrying full parental rights and responsibilities, without any of the stigma or sense of loss that adoption can sometimes carry in other cultural contexts. A child raised this way wasn't considered less connected to their birth family. Rather, they gained an additional, fully legitimate set of parents and siblings, their web of close kin simply widening rather than shifting.
Among many hunter-gatherer societies, orphaned children, inevitable in a world with genuinely significant risks of death during childbirth, illness, or accident, were rarely left without care. Researchers studying groups like the Aka and various San communities found that orphaned children were typically absorbed smoothly into the households of relatives or even unrelated community members, with remarkably little formal ceremony required, simply because the wider, distributed model of childcare we discussed earlier meant no child had ever depended on a single caregiver exclusively in the first place. This flexibility carried real, practical survival value. In a world without orphanages, without any formal social safety net of the kind modern societies eventually built, a community's ability to absorb a child who had lost their parents quickly, without trauma-inducing bureaucracy, simply through existing bonds of extended kinship and camp-wide familiarity, was quite literally the entire safety net available. A child in this world was rarely considered to belong to only two people. They belonged, in a very real and practical sense, to the whole surrounding web of people who already knew and loved them.
Chapter 44. Violence and its rarity. It's worth addressing something directly, because popular imagination often swings to extremes on this question. Was ancient life peaceful or brutally violent? The honest answer, based on the actual archaeological evidence, is more complicated than either extreme suggests. Some sites do show clear evidence of interpersonal violence, skeletal remains with healed or fatal wounds consistent with weapons, occasionally in numbers suggesting larger conflicts between groups. A site at Natarak in Kenya, dated to roughly 10,000 years ago, shows the remains of multiple individuals with injuries strongly suggesting a violent conflict between groups, one of the oldest pieces of direct evidence for organized group violence in the archaeological record. But researchers studying the broader pattern across many thousands of skeletal remains from earlier hunter-gatherer periods have found that rates of interpersonal violence varied enormously by region, time period, and circumstance, hardly the constant universal brutality sometimes assumed, nor a uniformly peaceful golden age either. Population density appears to matter significantly. Researchers have found that violence tends to increase measurably in the archaeological record in regions and periods where population pressure on limited resources was higher, and decrease in times and places of relative abundance and low competition for land or water. What does appear consistently across many studies is that the earlier leveling mechanisms and gift exchange networks we discussed, the Haksaro system, joking relationships between groups, formal reciprocity obligations, functioned at least in part as genuine conflict prevention tools, giving neighboring groups concrete, ongoing reasons to maintain peaceful relationships rather than default to hostility.
The truthful picture, then, isn't a simple story in either direction. It's a picture of real, sometimes serious risk of violence, met consistently across an enormous range of cultures with equally real, carefully developed social technology specifically designed to reduce and manage that risk. Technology built not from law books, but from relationship, memory, and mutual obligation, refined across an almost unimaginable span of generations. Chapter 45. How many people fit in a life? A modern person might maintain hundreds of contacts, thousands of social media connections. Ancient social life operated at a dramatically different, and arguably more sustainable, scale.
British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, studying the correlation between primate brain size and typical social group size, proposed what's now widely known as Dunbar's number, an estimate roughly around 150 individuals, representing the approximate upper limit of relationships a human can realistically maintain with any real depth and stability. A number Dunbar and later researchers found echoed with striking consistency across an enormous range of contexts, from the typical size of historical hunter-gatherer clan groupings to army company sizes across many different cultures and eras, to the average size of a stable personal social circle, even in the modern world. A typical hunter-gatherer band, the day-to-day living and traveling group, was often considerably smaller than this, commonly somewhere between 20 and 50 people, a size small enough that literally everyone knew literally everyone else intimately, their personalities, their histories, their reliability, their humor, in genuine accumulated detail built over years or an entire lifetime of close proximity.
The wider tribe or language group, encountered less frequently at the seasonal gatherings we discussed earlier, might extend toward that broader Dunbar's number range, familiar, recognized, connected through kinship or gift exchange, but not necessarily known with the same daily intimacy as one's immediate band. There's a real argument made by several researchers studying social cognition that the human brain itself may simply not be well suited to meaningfully process relationships far beyond this range, that the modern experience of knowing thousands of people online may function neurologically as something closer to a persistent low-grade overload rather than genuine social connection at all. Ancient social life, by contrast, operated entirely within a scale the human mind appears to have been built for.
Chapter 46. Small, Abundant, and Alive. When we picture ancient hunting, large game dominates the imagination: mammoths, bison, deer. But across an enormous range of documented cultures, a much smaller, far more reliable food source made up a genuinely significant part of the diet: insects. Entomophagy, the practice of eating insects, appears across a striking range of ancient and traditional diets worldwide. Termites, harvested in large quantities during their seasonal swarming flights, were and remain a valued, protein-rich food source across many African communities. Witchetty grubs, the large larvae of certain moths, were a prized, calorie-dense food among various Australian Aboriginal groups, gathered from the roots of specific plants with detailed, specialized knowledge of exactly where and when to find them. Locusts, grasshoppers, various beetle larvae, and ant eggs appear repeatedly across documented traditional diets on nearly every continent.
Nutritionally, this wasn't a marginal or desperate food choice, but often a genuinely excellent one. Many edible insects are remarkably high in protein, healthy fats, and micronutrients relative to their weight, and crucially, they were frequently far easier and more reliable to gather in bulk than successfully hunting large, fast, wary game, particularly during specific seasonal swarms, when enormous quantities could be collected within a single day's careful effort. Modern researchers studying sustainable food systems have, in recent years, circled back to insects with real interest, for many of the same practical reasons ancient foragers valued them originally: efficient conversion of available resources into dense, reliable nutrition, without the enormous land and water demands of raising larger livestock.
It's a small, easily overlooked detail in the larger story of ancient daily life, but a genuinely important one. A significant part of what kept people fed across enormous stretches of time and geography wasn't the dramatic mammoth hunt of popular imagination at all. It was small, abundant, easily gathered, and, by every modern nutritional measure, remarkably good food. Chapter 47. Watching Through the Night. Sleep, even in a well-chosen camp, was rarely entirely unguarded. Predators, rival groups, simple accidents with fire, all demanded some measure of ongoing vigilance, even after the day's work was done.
Researchers studying sleep patterns among modern hunter-gatherer groups, including detailed observational studies of the Hadza, have documented something they describe as a kind of natural, informally rotating watch. At almost any given point during the night, across the sleep-monitored individuals in a camp, at least one person tends to be awake, or in a very light stage of sleep, not through any formally assigned schedule or roster, but simply as an emergent pattern arising naturally from individual differences in sleep timing and depth across a group of people sleeping in reasonably close proximity to one another. This finding carries a genuinely interesting implication. The fragmented, sometimes lighter sleep architecture some researchers have observed in these communities, waking briefly here and there through the night, discussed earlier in the context of segmented sleep, may not purely be a biological quirk. It may, at least in part, be a functional adaptation, an evolved or culturally reinforced pattern that happens to ensure a camp is rarely, if ever, collectively fully unconscious and unguarded at the same moment.
Fires were typically kept low but not fully extinguished through the night, both for warmth and as an active deterrent. Most large predators show a strong, well-documented aversion to fire and its light. Sleeping arrangements themselves often clustered people physically close together, sometimes within a shared shelter or tightly grouped individual ones, offering both warmth and the simple, reassuring safety of proximity to others. There's something worth noticing in this: the vulnerability of sleep, genuinely one of the most exposed, defenseless states a human body enters, was never faced entirely alone. It was managed, quietly and collectively, by the simple, ancient fact of sleeping surrounded by people who, even unconsciously, were rarely all deeply asleep at exactly the same time.
Chapter 48. Counting the Moon. We touched earlier on tally bones possibly tracking lunar cycles. One researcher, Alexander Marshak, took this idea further, and his work, while debated, remains genuinely fascinating. Examining numerous notched bone and antler artifacts from Ice Age Europe under magnification, Marshak proposed that many of these objects showed marks made incrementally, over time, in groups and patterns consistent with tracking the phases of the moon across multiple consecutive months. Not a single tally made all at once, but ongoing records added to gradually, night by night or day by day, over extended periods.
If Marshak's interpretation holds, even partially, it suggests something genuinely significant: that systematic, ongoing timekeeping, tied specifically to the moon's roughly 29-day cycle, may be tens of thousands of years older than any calendar system typically discussed in conventional historical accounts. Some researchers studying the social role of this kind of tracking have connected it specifically to women's reproductive cycles, given how closely a lunar month aligns with a typical menstrual cycle, suggesting that some of humanity's very earliest systematic record-keeping may have been developed and maintained by women,
tracking fertility and cycle timing with real practical physical relevance to daily life, long before any of the more commonly discussed great male inventions of history.
The moon itself, beyond any formal tracking, structured an enormous amount of ancient daily and nightly life simply through its light. A full moon meant genuinely useful illumination for nighttime travel or activity that would have been impossible in complete darkness. A new moon meant true, deep darkness, likely shifting activity patterns accordingly, perhaps more caution, more reliance on the fire's light alone, a different rhythm to the night entirely, repeating reliably, predictably, roughly every 29 days, for the entire span of a human life. Chapter 49. Games, Bones, and Chance. Leisure time, as we discussed early on, was genuinely abundant in many ancient societies, and a meaningful share of it, evidence suggests, was spent playing games.
Astragali, the small, roughly cube-shaped ankle bones of sheep or goats, have been found at archaeological sites across an enormous span of time and geography, often in quantities and contexts strongly suggesting they were used for games of chance, tossed and read much like dice would be used much later. Some showed deliberate wear patterns or modifications consistent with repeated handling and use in exactly this way, and some sites show them alongside carved gaming boards, evidence of games with real, structured rules rather than idle tossing. Mancala-style games, involving moving small stones or seeds between carved pits or holes in a board, appear across an enormous range of African cultures, with archaeological evidence for boards carved directly into stone in some locations, stretching back a considerable span of time, and the game remains widely played in countless regional variations to this day, representing an unusually direct, unbroken thread connecting ancient leisure directly to a living modern tradition. Board games involving strategic movement of pieces, sometimes interpreted as ancestors of games conceptually related to modern checkers or similar strategy games, appear at various ancient sites. Carved boards found scratched into stone surfaces or flat rock outcrops, evidence of a genuine, sustained cultural investment in structured play, not merely idle time passing. None of this should be surprising, given everything we've already discussed about the genuine abundance of unstructured time available in many ancient societies. People with real leisure time, it turns out, have consistently, across nearly every culture and era researchers have studied, chosen to spend at least some meaningful portion of it exactly the way people still do now, gathered together, laughing, arguing gently over the rules, genuinely delighted by a game of chance or skill. Chapter 50. What Teeth Remember. Bones tell part of the story of an ancient life. Teeth, it turns out, often tell an even more detailed one. Dental analysis has become one of archaeology's most valuable tools for reconstructing individual life histories. Enamel hypoplasia, small, measurable defects in tooth enamel that form specifically during periods of significant childhood illness or nutritional stress, allow researchers to identify, sometimes with real precision, exactly which years of a person's early childhood included serious hardship, essentially reading a rough health diary embedded directly into the permanent structure of their teeth. Isotope analysis of tooth enamel, examining the specific chemical signatures absorbed from food and water during the years each tooth was forming, can reveal a surprising amount about diet and even geographic movement, whether a person grew up eating primarily coastal or inland foods, for instance, or whether they spent their early childhood in a genuinely different region from where they were eventually buried, offering direct physical evidence of migration within a single lifetime. Dental wear patterns themselves reveal detailed information about diet and even non-food tool use. Some ancient populations show wear patterns strongly consistent with using teeth as a third hand for tasks like softening hide or gripping cordage while the hands were occupied elsewhere, a small, physically permanent record of specific, repeated daily labor.
Perhaps most remarkably, researchers analyzing ancient dental plaque, mineralized deposits that trap and preserve microscopic food particles, pollen, and even ancient bacterial DNA, have been able to reconstruct startlingly specific details about individual meals eaten thousands of years before, identifying particular plant species consumed, and in some cases, evidence of medicinal plants used specifically to treat illness, effectively recovering a genuine physical fragment of someone's actual individual lived experience, preserved by pure chance in the hardest, most durable part of the human body. Chapter 51. Skilled Hands, Not Assigned Roles. We've discussed general patterns, women more often gathering, men more often hunting large game. But the archaeological and ethnographic record, examined closely, resists being reduced to a single rigid rule applied everywhere equally.
Analysis of ancient burial sites has occasionally overturned long-held assumptions directly. A roughly 9,000-year-old burial in the Andes, examined using modern methods to determine biological sex from skeletal and dental evidence, rather than relying purely on the type of grave goods present, was found to belong to a woman buried alongside a substantial big-game hunting toolkit, projectile points, and animal processing tools consistent with active, skilled hunting, prompting the original research team to re-examine several other ancient burials previously assumed without direct biological testing to be male simply because of the tools buried alongside them, and finding a meaningfully higher proportion of female hunters represented in the sample than earlier assumptions had allowed for. Ethnographic studies of living hunter-gatherer societies show real variation as well. Among the Agta people of the Philippines, women have been documented actively participating in hunting, including hunting genuinely large game alongside men, using bows, and in some accounts even hunting dogs, challenging any assumption that active big game hunting was ever universally restricted to men across all cultures and time periods. What emerges from this closer examination isn't a simple reversal of the old assumption, but something more accurate and, honestly, more interesting. A picture of real, meaningful flexibility, where individual skill, interest, and circumstance appeared to have mattered considerably, alongside broader cultural patterns that did genuinely exist, but were rarely absolute or universally rigid. Ancient daily life, in other words, wasn't governed by a single fixed script assigned identically to every person by category alone. It allowed, at least sometimes and in at least some places, for individual aptitude to shape the role a person actually filled.
Chapter 52. Living Without Walls. Modern life places enormous value on privacy. A closed door, a private room, personal space clearly marked and defended. Ancient camp life operated under an almost entirely different set of assumptions. In most hunter-gatherer camps, shelters were small, close together, and offered limited acoustic or visual privacy by modern standards. Conversations, disputes, even intimate moments between partners were often conducted within genuine earshot of much of the surrounding camp, an arrangement anthropologists studying these communities describe not as a hardship quietly endured, but as simply the unremarkable, taken-for-granted texture of daily life, requiring no particular discretion because privacy, in the specific modern sense,
was never really an expectation held by anyone in the first place.
This lack of privacy carried real social functions, tightly connected to the leveling mechanisms and communal conflict resolution methods discussed earlier. A dispute conducted loudly enough for the wider camp to hear naturally invited wider input, wider mediation, a kind of built-in community oversight that a more private, closed-door argument would never receive. Wrongdoing, similarly, was considerably harder to hide entirely in a camp where nearly everyone could observe nearly everyone else's daily behavior in close, ongoing detail. That said, researchers studying camp layouts across various cultures have noted that a kind of situational, negotiated privacy did still exist even without physical walls to enforce it. Certain conversations conducted in lowered voices, certain activities moved slightly apart from the main gathering, certain social cues respected by others as a signal not to approach or listen too closely. Privacy in this context wasn't architectural, it was behavioral and relational, maintained through mutual, unwritten courtesy rather than a locked door.
It's a genuinely different way of organizing a life, one where nearly everything was witnessed by nearly everyone, nearly all the time, and where that constant, close visibility functioned less as an intrusion and more as one more quiet thread holding an interdependent community together. Chapter 53. Mining the Earth. The ochre we discussed earlier, used for body decoration and burial ritual, didn't simply appear conveniently underfoot wherever it was needed. In many cases, it had to be deliberately extracted, sometimes through what can only be described as genuine mining.
At a site called Lion Cave in Eswatini, also known as Ngwenya, archaeological evidence shows ochre extraction dating back over 40,000 years, involving people deliberately digging into a hillside, following mineral-rich veins underground using stone tools, in what many researchers consider one of the oldest known mining operations in the entire archaeological record, anywhere on Earth. Flint and other high-quality tool-making stone were similarly sourced in many regions from specific known outcrops or shallow underground deposits, rather than simply gathered as loose surface stones. Neolithic flint mines at sites like Grimes Graves in England, though somewhat later than the very earliest ochre mining, show extensive networks of shafts and connecting tunnels, dug entirely with tools made of antler and bone, representing a genuinely significant, coordinated, and physically demanding labor investment, undertaken specifically to access flint of a quality that surface deposits alone couldn't reliably match.
This kind of mining required detailed geological knowledge, passed down and refined across generations, an intimate understanding of exactly where a particular valuable material could reliably be found beneath the surface, which required real expertise to locate and real, sometimes genuinely dangerous physical labor to extract. It's a detail that quietly complicates any lingering image of ancient life as simple, opportunistic scavenging of whatever happened to lie on the surface. In numerous documented cases, people were already digging, deliberately and skillfully, into the earth itself, pursuing specific, valuable materials they knew from accumulated generational knowledge could be found there, using tools and techniques refined across a very long, patient tradition of underground extraction.
Chapter 54. Houses of Bone.
In the coldest reaches of the Ice Age, particularly across the open, largely treeless steppe of what is now Ukraine and parts of Russia, ancient people faced a genuinely difficult architectural problem. How do you build an effective shelter in a landscape almost entirely without trees for timber? The remarkable answer, preserved at several archaeological sites, was mammoth bone.
At locations like Mezhirich in Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered the remains of substantial dwellings constructed almost entirely from mammoth bones and tusks. Skulls, jaws, leg bones, and long, curving tusks, carefully selected and arranged into a stable structural framework, likely then covered with hide for insulation and weatherproofing. Building one of these structures required a genuinely significant number of mammoth bones. Researchers studying the Mezhirich site identified the remains of dozens of individual mammoths represented in the bone material used for construction, though it's likely these bones were largely scavenged over time from natural mammoth deaths, rather than representing dozens of dedicated mammoth hunts undertaken purely for building material. The engineering involved was genuinely sophisticated. Skulls and heavy pelvic bones were often used as a stable foundation layer, with lighter bones and tusks arranged above in overlapping, load-bearing patterns clearly designed with real structural logic, not simply piled randomly. Some of these dwellings show evidence of specialized internal features, distinct hearths, and in some cases apparent storage pits dug into the floor, suggesting a level of planned, deliberate interior organization.
These mammoth bone dwellings represent one of the more startling examples of ancient adaptability in the entire archaeological record. People facing a landscape that offered almost none of the conventional building materials we'd assume were necessary, and responding not with simple, desperate survival, but with genuine architectural ingenuity, building warm, structurally sound, long-term winter shelters from the enormous skeletal remains of the largest land animals then living alongside them. Chapter 55: The Long Walk Out of Africa. Every thread we followed tonight, the tools, the fire, the language, the art, traces back, ultimately, to a single long migration, unfolding across an almost incomprehensible span of time.
Genetic and archaeological evidence together indicate that modern humans originated in Africa, with the ancestors of every non-African population on Earth today departing the continent in a series of migrations, the most significant and best documented of which occurred roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago, though earlier, smaller migration attempts, some of which may not have left surviving descendants, appear to stretch back further still. One particularly compelling theory, sometimes called the coastal migration or beachcomber route, proposes that early migrating populations moved along coastlines specifically, rather than primarily through interior continental routes, following the reliable, rich food resources of coastal and nearshore marine environments we discussed earlier, effectively island hopping and coast hugging their way with remarkable speed across enormous distances, from Africa through the Arabian Peninsula, along the coast of South Asia, and eventually reaching as far as Australia within a relatively short span of time by evolutionary standards.
This migration wasn't a single planned journey, undertaken with any destination in mind. It unfolded instead, gradually, generation by generation, a band moving slightly further along a coastline or river valley than their parents had, following resources, following curiosity, following the same fundamental drive toward water, food, and viable territory that shaped every single chapter of ancient daily life we've discussed tonight. By the time humans reached the farthest corners of the habitable world, the tip of South America, the high Arctic, remote Pacific islands, reached only by the open ocean voyaging we discussed earlier, an unbroken chain of ordinary days connected every single step of that journey. Ordinary mornings, ordinary gathering, ordinary fires lit each evening in landscape after landscape, until eventually, gradually,
Without any single dramatic moment marking the achievement, humans had reached nearly everywhere the Earth had to offer.
Chapter 56. Clay before pottery. Pottery, fired clay vessels used for cooking and storage, is often treated as a marker of the Neolithic transition we discussed earlier, arriving alongside agriculture and settled life. But the very oldest fired clay objects discovered are stranger and considerably older than that assumption suggests. At Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, archaeologists uncovered small fired clay figurines, animal and human forms, deliberately shaped and then fired in a simple kiln structure dating back roughly 26,000 years, many thousands of years before any functional fired clay cooking vessel appears anywhere in the archaeological record. This means the technical knowledge required to fire clay, controlling heat, understanding how wet clay transforms permanently under sufficient temperature, was mastered by fully nomadic, pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers and applied, initially, not to practical vessels at all, but to art.
Detailed analysis of fragments found at the site revealed something else genuinely interesting. Many of the fired pieces show evidence of deliberate thermal shock fracturing, breaking apart explosively during the firing process itself, in a pattern consistent with the clay having been intentionally formed while still containing excess moisture, causing it to shatter dramatically when fired. Some researchers have proposed this may not have been a simple technical failure at all, but a deliberately induced effect, clay figurines made specifically to explode during a fire-based ritual, the shattering itself potentially serving a ceremonial or symbolic purpose we can now only guess at. Whatever the exact intention, the underlying fact remains genuinely striking. The technology to transform soft, shapeless clay permanently through fire into something hard and lasting existed among fully mobile hunter-gatherers tens of thousands of years before anyone applied that same knowledge toward the practical cooking pots so often associated with settled agricultural life.
Art, once again, as with the ochre and the beads and the cave paintings, appears to have arrived well before necessity demanded it. Chapter 57. A Moment Alone. Across everything we've walked through tonight, the shared fires, the communal childcare, the camps with almost no real privacy, it would be easy to imagine ancient life as constantly, inescapably social, never offering a single quiet moment alone. But that wasn't quite the whole picture either. Certain tasks, by their nature, pulled a person away from the group, at least briefly. A long, gathering walk, undertaken alone or with just one companion, moving quietly through familiar territory. A solitary watch, kept at the edge of camp through part of the night. A private walk to a specific known place, a particular quiet clearing, a specific spot beside water, sometimes undertaken deliberately for reasons that had little to do with any practical task at all. Some anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherer societies have noted that solitary time, while genuinely less common and less structurally emphasized than in modern individualist cultures, was neither absent nor considered strange when it did occur. A person grieving, a person working through a difficult decision, a person simply needing quiet, often found or created that space, briefly, within the rhythm of an otherwise deeply communal life, and the wider group, in many documented cases, seemed to understand and respect the need for it, without requiring explanation.
There's something worth noticing in that. A life built almost entirely around close community, shared fires, and constant company still made room, when it was genuinely needed, for a person to simply walk a little further than usual, sit somewhere quiet, and be alone with their own thoughts for a while. Not as a rejection of the group,
but simply as one more ordinary, unremarkable part of an ordinary day, the same way it still is now, whenever any of us finally finds a few quiet minutes entirely our own. Chapter 58. What we carried forward. So here we are, long after that fire has gone cold, long after those particular stars have shifted their positions in a sky none of them would fully recognize now. And yet, somehow, pieces of that old life are still inside you.
The way your body still, quietly, wants to sleep when it's dark and rise when it's light, even if a screen argues otherwise. The way a good story, told gently, can still soften something guarded in you, the same way it once softened faces around a fire. The way you still instinctively feel better after time spent with people who know you well. The way a small band once relied on exactly that kind of closeness to survive. You didn't inherit a job. Jobs are new, a blink, an eye blink, against the long span of human history. What you inherited, instead, is older and much harder to lose. A body built for rhythm, not constant urgency. A mind built for story, not spreadsheets. A nervous system that still, after everything, expects rest to be normal, expects the night to be long enough, expects that waking briefly in the dark is not a failure, but simply part of how sleep has always worked.
Tonight, let your body remember what it already knows, underneath everything modern life has layered on top. No alarm waiting to interrupt this, no calendar demanding anything of tomorrow you just yet. Just warmth, quiet, and the same slow permission your ancestors gave themselves every single night for 300,000 years. Rest now. You've earned nothing you need to prove to deserve it. You simply get to. Sleep well.